Over the past decade, artificial intelligence has undergone a remarkable transformation, evolving from a largely theoretical discipline into a pervasive force that exerts influence across virtually every dimension of contemporary life. What was once confined to academic discourse and speculative projections has now become deeply embedded in the fabric of everyday existence. From curating the information we consume to optimizing the routes we travel, from facilitating professional workflows to personalizing entertainment, algorithmic systems have become increasingly instrumental in shaping human behavior. Their proliferation has been so extensive that many individuals interact with artificial intelligence on a daily basis without even consciously recognizing its presence. What renders this technological phenomenon particularly intriguing is not merely its computational sophistication, but the growing degree of confidence that people place in algorithmic judgment. Increasingly, individuals are willing to entrust complex decisions to systems capable of processing immense quantities of information within fractions of a second. Recommendations generated by artificial intelligence now influence purchasing decisions, educational pursuits, financial planning, and even interpersonal interactions. As a consequence, the traditional assumption that decision-making is an exclusively human prerogative appears to be undergoing a profound reconfiguration. Observing this paradigm shift prompted a series of questions that became increasingly difficult to dismiss. If artificial intelligence possesses the capacity to identify inefficiencies, recognize behavioral patterns, and formulate optimized strategies based on empirical data, could it conceivably orchestrate an ordinary day more effectively than I could myself? To what extent are my daily choices genuinely rational, and to what extent are they dictated by habit, procrastination, convenience, or unconscious bias? More importantly, if I were to relinquish complete control over my schedule and allow an algorithmic entity to dictate every significant decision for an entire day, what conclusions might emerge from such an experiment? The more I contemplated these questions, the more I realized that this undertaking represented far more than a simple productivity challenge. At its core, it constituted an exploration of a broader philosophical dilemma concerning the relationship between human autonomy and technological intervention. Modern society frequently celebrates optimization as an unequivocal virtue, yet efficiency alone does not necessarily equate to fulfillment, satisfaction, or well-being. Human existence is characterized by spontaneity, emotional complexity, contextual nuance, and innumerable variables that often resist quantification. Consequently, I found myself wondering whether a system designed to maximize productivity could adequately accommodate the intricate realities of everyday life. Simultaneously, my curiosity was accompanied by a considerable degree of skepticism. While artificial intelligence undoubtedly excels at analyzing data and generating highly structured recommendations, I remained uncertain about its capacity to navigate unforeseen contingencies and ambiguous circumstances. Human beings routinely adapt to situations that cannot be anticipated in advance, drawing upon intuition, experience, and contextual understanding. Whether an algorithm could demonstrate comparable adaptability remained an open question. The prospect of discovering the answer firsthand was both intellectually stimulating and mildly disconcerting. Ultimately, curiosity prevailed over hesitation. Rather than continuing to speculate about the capabilities and limitations of artificial intelligence from a theoretical standpoint, I resolved to subject myself to a practical experiment. For one entire day, every major decision would be delegated to AI. However, before such an arrangement could be implemented, the system first needed to acquire a comprehensive understanding of my routines, objectives, preferences, and behavioral tendencies. Only then could it construct the meticulously orchestrated itinerary that would govern the following day. Having resolved to transform a theoretical curiosity into a tangible experiment, I was confronted with a practical necessity. Before artificial intelligence could assume responsibility for orchestrating my day, it first needed to acquire a sufficiently comprehensive understanding of the individual whose life it was about to govern. Contrary to popular misconceptions, AI does not possess an innate awareness of personal circumstances. Its recommendations are only as effective as the information upon which they are predicated. Consequently, the success or failure of the experiment would depend largely on the extent to which I could accurately communicate the intricacies of my daily existence. I therefore began by providing the system with an extensive overview of my routines, obligations, aspirations, and behavioral tendencies. I described my typical waking hours, my academic commitments, my preferred methods of studying, and the recurring distractions that frequently undermined my productivity. I outlined the tasks I routinely postponed, the habits I wished to cultivate, and the objectives I hoped to accomplish in the foreseeable future. In addition, I disclosed various preferences concerning exercise, leisure activities, dietary habits, and periods of peak concentration. What initially appeared to be a straightforward exchange of information gradually evolved into something considerably more revealing. As I articulated these details, I became increasingly aware of how rarely I examined my own behavior with such precision. Human beings often navigate their daily lives through instinct and repetition, seldom pausing to scrutinize the patterns that govern their actions. Yet the process of supplying information to the AI compelled me to undertake an unusually rigorous form of self-assessment. Every habit required justification. Every preference demanded clarification. Every objective necessitated prioritization. In attempting to explain myself to a machine, I found myself gaining a deeper understanding of my own routines than I had anticipated. Once the information had been submitted, the system began generating recommendations with remarkable speed. Within moments, it produced a meticulously structured schedule that extended from the instant I awoke until the moment I was expected to retire for the evening. What immediately struck me was the extraordinary degree of specificity embedded within the itinerary. This was not a vague collection of suggestions or broad productivity principles. Rather, it resembled a comprehensive operational blueprint designed to maximize efficiency across every segment of the day. Each activity was allocated a precise time frame. Periods of concentrated work were interspersed with strategically scheduled intervals of rest. Physical exercise was incorporated to promote sustained energy levels. Meals were assigned designated durations intended to prevent unnecessary procrastination. Even recreational activities were carefully calibrated to ensure that relaxation did not encroach excessively upon productivity. The schedule exhibited a level of organizational sophistication that bordered on obsessive. Initially, I found the plan undeniably impressive. Its structure reflected a degree of coherence and intentionality that was often absent from my own approach to time management. Every recommendation appeared to serve a discernible purpose. Every component seemed interconnected with a broader objective. The itinerary conveyed the impression that the day had been engineered rather than merely arranged. It was difficult not to admire the elegance of a system capable of transforming a collection of fragmented personal details into a seemingly optimized sequence of actions. Yet alongside this admiration emerged a subtle sense of unease. As I examined the schedule more closely, I realized that I was no longer evaluating a collection of suggestions. I was contemplating a framework that would effectively dictate how I spent the next 24 hours. Although participation in the experiment remained entirely voluntary, the implications of that realization were unexpectedly profound. By agreeing to follow the AI's instructions, I was not simply accepting advice. I was temporarily relinquishing a degree of personal autonomy. The psychological dimension of this decision proved far more significant than I had anticipated. In everyday life, countless choices are made almost unconsciously. We decide when to begin a task, when to take a break, when to postpone a responsibility, or when to indulge a fleeting impulse. Such decisions may appear trivial in isolation, yet collectively they constitute a substantial component of personal freedom. To surrender those choices, even temporarily, required a level of trust that I had not initially appreciated. This realization prompted a series of reflections concerning the broader role of technology in modern society. Increasingly, individuals permit algorithms to influence what they read, watch, purchase, and believe. Navigation systems determine travel routes. Recommendation engines shape cultural consumption. Predictive algorithms influence professional opportunities and financial decisions. In many respects, society has already become accustomed to delegating certain forms of judgment to machines. My experiment merely represented a more conspicuous manifestation of a process that was already unfolding on a much larger scale. Despite these philosophical considerations, practical concerns soon began to dominate my thoughts. Could I genuinely adhere to such a rigid schedule for an entire day? Would the recommendations remain viable when confronted with the inevitable unpredictability of real life? More importantly, how would I respond when the system instructed me to perform actions that conflicted with my instincts, preferences, or immediate desires? These uncertainties lingered in my mind as I reviewed the itinerary repeatedly, attempting to anticipate the challenges that might emerge. As the evening progressed, the schedule acquired an almost symbolic significance. It no longer appeared to be merely a collection of appointments and tasks. Instead, it represented a test of whether algorithmic precision could successfully govern the inherently imperfect realities of human existence. The following day would reveal whether the theoretical elegance of the plan could withstand practical implementation. Eventually, there was nothing left to analyze. The itinerary had been finalized, the parameters established, and the rules of the experiment unequivocally defined. All that remained was to put the system's recommendations into practice. With a mixture of anticipation, skepticism, and intellectual curiosity, I prepared for the following morning, aware that the true experiment was only about to begin. The moment I opened my eyes the next day, every decision, no matter how insignificant it seemed, would be guided not by habit or intuition, but by the meticulously orchestrated directives of artificial intelligence. The following morning began with an unfamiliar sensation, the awareness that the sequence of events awaiting me had already been determined before I had even opened my eyes. Ordinarily, the first few minutes of my day were characterized by spontaneity and discretion. Some mornings I would rise immediately, while on others I would remain in bed for several additional minutes, negotiating with my own reluctance to begin the day. Yet on this particular occasion, no such deliberation was necessary. The itinerary generated by artificial intelligence had already prescribed precisely what was expected of me, and my sole responsibility was to comply. As soon as I awoke, I resisted the habitual temptation to reach for my phone. Under normal circumstances, the allure of notifications, messages, and social media updates would have been almost irresistible. The AI, however, had explicitly advised against exposing myself to digital distractions immediately after waking. Instead, the first activity on the schedule was remarkably simple: drink a glass of water and spend several minutes engaging in light physical movement. Although the instruction appeared somewhat mundane, I adhered to it without modification. What struck me almost immediately was the intentionality underlying even the most seemingly insignificant recommendations. Unlike my usual morning routine, which often unfolded without conscious reflection, every action now possessed a clearly articulated rationale. Hydration was intended to counteract the physiological effects of sleep. Stretching was designed to enhance circulation and facilitate cognitive alertness. Exposure to natural light was recommended to regulate circadian rhythms and improve wakefulness. Each component of the schedule appeared to be grounded in a coherent logic that sought to optimize both physical and mental performance. Initially, I found this degree of structure surprisingly reassuring. The absence of decision-making eliminated a subtle but persistent source of cognitive fatigue. Rather than expending mental energy determining what to do next, I simply proceeded from one activity to another according to the itinerary. The experience was almost mechanical, yet not entirely unpleasant. In fact, there was a certain elegance in the simplicity of execution. The ambiguity that frequently accompanies self-directed routines had been replaced by a sequence of clearly defined objectives. As the morning progressed, I began to appreciate the extent to which ordinary life is saturated with micro-decisions. Every day, individuals make countless choices concerning priorities, timing, and resource allocation. Most of these decisions are so routine that they escape conscious notice. Yet when responsibility for those decisions is delegated to an external system, their cumulative significance becomes remarkably apparent. For perhaps the first time, I became acutely aware of how much mental bandwidth is devoted to determining not merely how to perform tasks, but which tasks deserve attention in the first place. The first substantial block of the schedule was dedicated to focused work. According to the RI's recommendations, this period was to be conducted without interruptions, multitasking, or unnecessary distractions. Notifications were disabled. Non-essential browser tabs were closed. External stimuli were minimized as much as possible. The objective was straightforward: concentrate exclusively on a single task for an uninterrupted period of time. At first, the arrangement felt unusually restrictive. Modern digital environments encourage constant shifts in attention, making sustained concentration increasingly difficult to maintain. My instinctive impulse was to alternate between tasks, check messages, or briefly browse unrelated content. Yet because I had committed myself to following the RI's directives without deviation, I resisted these impulses. To my surprise, the initial discomfort gradually subsided. Once the temptation to divide my attention diminished, the work itself became considerably more manageable. By the conclusion of the session, I had accomplished substantially more than I typically would during an equivalent period. The improvement was not dramatic enough to seem miraculous, yet it was undeniable. The experience suggested that productivity is often undermined not by insufficient effort, but by fragmented attention. The AI had not instructed me to work harder. It had simply structured the environment in a manner that reduced opportunities for distraction. This realization persisted throughout the remainder of the morning. Each transition between activities was governed by predetermined parameters. Meals were consumed without simultaneously scrolling through digital content. Short breaks were intentionally scheduled rather than taken impulsively. Even leisure activities were approached with a degree of moderation that contrasted sharply with my usual habits. The cumulative effect was a day that felt unusually coherent. Instead of drifting between competing priorities, I moved through a sequence of deliberate actions that appeared interconnected by a broader strategic framework. Nevertheless, despite these apparent advantages, a subtle tension began to emerge beneath the surface. While the itinerary excelled at providing structure, it left little room for spontaneity. The system assumed that every activity would proceed according to plan, that every transition would occur seamlessly, and that external circumstances would remain sufficiently predictable to accommodate the schedule. In reality, however, human life rarely conforms so neatly to theoretical expectations. Several times throughout the day, I found myself questioning whether strict adherence remained the most sensible course of action. Certain tasks required slightly more time than anticipated. Unexpected interruptions arose. Minor inconveniences disrupted the smooth progression envisioned by the itinerary. None of these complications were particularly severe, yet they highlighted an important distinction between optimization in theory and implementation in practice. A schedule may appear flawless when viewed abstractly, but real life is characterized by innumerable variables that resist prediction. Despite these emerging concerns, I remained committed to the experiment. Having already observed tangible benefits in terms of focus, efficiency, and organization, I was reluctant to abandon the methodology prematurely. At the same time, however, I could not ignore the growing suspicion that the system's effectiveness might diminish as reality became increasingly complex. The true test would not occur during periods of stability, but rather when circumstances deviated from the assumptions upon which the itinerary had been constructed. By the time the afternoon approached, that suspicion was becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss. Small discrepancies between the schedule and actual events were beginning to accumulate. Tasks occasionally extended beyond their allotted durations. Certain recommendations seemed less practical when confronted with situational constraints. For the first time since the experiment had begun, I found myself confronting a question that would soon become impossible to avoid. What happens when a meticulously optimized plan encounters the unpredictability of reality? It was a question that the remainder of the day would answer more forcefully than I could have anticipated. As the afternoon unfolded, the experiment entered a markedly different phase. Throughout the morning, the AI-generated itinerary had appeared remarkably effective. Its recommendations had promoted focus, minimized distractions, and imposed a degree of structure that I had rarely achieved independently. For several hours, the system's logic seemed almost irrefutable. Yet the true challenge of any organizational framework lies not in its performance under ideal conditions, but in its capacity to withstand disruption. It was precisely at this juncture that the first significant cracks began to appear in the otherwise immaculate architecture of the schedule. The initial complications were relatively minor. A task that had been allocated 45 minutes required closer to an hour. An unexpected message demanded immediate attention. A brief interruption evolved into a longer delay than anticipated. None of these incidents were particularly dramatic, yet their cumulative effect gradually altered the trajectory of the day. The itinerary had been constructed upon the assumption that activities would proceed according to predefined durations, but reality exhibited little interest in conforming to those expectations. What became increasingly apparent was that artificial intelligence, despite its computational sophistication, operated within a framework of probabilities rather than certainties. It could analyze patterns, anticipate likely outcomes, and formulate optimized schedules based upon available information. However, it could not fully account for the innumerable variables that characterize human existence. Daily life is not a controlled environment governed exclusively by logic and predictability. It is an ever-shifting landscape shaped by interruptions, emotional fluctuations, unforeseen obligations, and countless contextual factors that resist quantification. As deviations from the schedule accumulated, I found myself confronting a dilemma. Should I continue adhering rigidly to the itinerary, even when circumstances suggested that flexibility would be more practical? Or should I modify the schedule in response to emerging realities, thereby compromising the integrity of the experiment itself? The question was more complicated than it initially appeared. On one hand, strict compliance was necessary if I wished to evaluate the effectiveness of the AI's recommendations accurately. On the other hand, blind obedience to an increasingly imperfect plan seemed counterproductive. This tension revealed a fundamental distinction between algorithmic optimization and human adaptability. A machine excels at constructing systems based upon identifiable patterns and logical relationships. Human beings, however, possess the capacity to improvise when those systems encounter unexpected obstacles. We routinely alter priorities, reassess objectives, and respond to circumstances that could never have been anticipated in advance. Such adaptability is often viewed as inefficient from a purely computational perspective, yet it is precisely what enables individuals to navigate an unpredictable world. The more I reflected upon this distinction, the more I began to appreciate the complexity of seemingly ordinary decisions. Earlier in the day, I had celebrated the elimination of decision fatigue and the convenience of allowing an external system to dictate my actions. Yet I was now discovering that decision-making serves a purpose beyond simple efficiency. It provides the flexibility required to reconcile abstract plans with concrete realities. Without that flexibility, even the most meticulously designed schedule can become increasingly detached from the circumstances it was intended to organize. At several points, I experienced a subtle but growing frustration. Certain recommendations that had appeared entirely reasonable during the planning stage now seemed strangely impractical. For example, the schedule assumed seamless transitions between activities, overlooking the inevitable delays that accompany real-world tasks. It prescribed periods of focused work without considering the possibility of unexpected obligations. It allocated specific durations for breaks while failing to acknowledge that human concentration does not always conform to predetermined intervals. These shortcomings were not evidence of incompetence, rather, they reflected the inherent limitations of a system attempting to impose order upon an environment characterized by uncertainty. Nevertheless, I was reluctant to dismiss the AI's contributions entirely. Despite the emerging complications, the experiment continued to yield valuable insights. Even when individual recommendations proved imperfect, the overarching structure of the itinerary remained beneficial. I was still accomplishing more than I typically would on an average day. My attention remained more focused, my priorities more clearly defined, and my use of time more deliberate. The deficiencies of the system did not negate its strengths, instead, they highlighted the necessity of balancing optimization with adaptability. This realization prompted a broader reflection on society's relationship with technology. Public discourse often portrays artificial intelligence through extremes. Some regard it as an infallible solution capable of revolutionizing every aspect of human existence, while others view it as an inherently flawed technology destined to disappoint. My experience suggested that neither perspective was entirely accurate. The reality appeared considerably more nuanced. AI was neither omniscient nor incompetent. It was an extraordinarily powerful tool, whose effectiveness depended upon the context in which it was applied and the expectations imposed upon it. As the afternoon progressed, my attitude toward the experiment began to evolve. Initially, I had approached the challenge as a test of whether artificial intelligence could outperform human judgment. By this stage, however, the question itself seemed increasingly simplistic. The issue was no longer whether AI was superior or inferior. Instead, it concerned the conditions under which each mode of decision-making was most effective. Algorithms excelled at identifying patterns and optimizing routines. Humans excelled at interpreting ambiguity and navigating complexity. Rather than existing in opposition, these capabilities appeared complementary. Ironically, it was only after the schedule began to falter that I truly started learning from it. The imperfections exposed aspects of my own behavior that might otherwise have remained invisible. They revealed how frequently plans require adjustment, how often productivity depends upon context, and how essential flexibility is to sustained effectiveness. In many respects, the experiment became more illuminating precisely because the itinerary was not flawless. By late afternoon, another unexpected realization began to emerge. Despite the various disruptions and inconsistencies, the day was still progressing more efficiently than most ordinary days. Certain habits that typically undermined my productivity had been significantly reduced. Periods of distraction had become less frequent. Tasks that I might normally postpone had already been completed. The more I examined the situation, the more I recognized that even an imperfect system could generate meaningful improvements. This growing awareness gradually shifted my focus away from the schedule's shortcomings and toward its benefits. Rather than dwelling exclusively on the instances where the AI had failed to anticipate reality, I found myself becoming increasingly interested in the advantages that had materialized throughout the day. Some of those advantages had been expected. Others had emerged entirely by surprise. As the experiment continued, it became clear that the most revealing discoveries were still ahead. What began as an examination of unforeseen complications was now evolving into an exploration of unexpected gains, benefits that I had neither predicted nor fully appreciated when the day first began. By the time the experiment entered its latter stages, my attention had gradually shifted away from the shortcomings of the AI-generated itinerary and toward a far more revealing realization. Although the schedule had encountered numerous obstacles throughout the day, it had nevertheless succeeded in exposing patterns of behavior that I had previously overlooked. The most valuable outcome was not the schedule itself, but the perspective it provided. For the first time, I was observing my daily habits through a lens of deliberate scrutiny rather than passive acceptance. One of the most striking discoveries concerned the cumulative impact of seemingly insignificant inefficiencies. Prior to the experiment, I had often attributed unproductive days to major disruptions, demanding responsibilities, or a lack of available time. However, the AI-generated framework revealed a different reality. In many cases, productivity was not being undermined by substantial obstacles, but by a multitude of minor distractions that, when combined, consumed a remarkable proportion of the day. A few minutes spent checking notifications. Several moments lost to unnecessary multitasking. Brief episodes of procrastination disguised as harmless breaks. Individually, such behaviors appeared inconsequential. Yet when viewed collectively, they represented a significant erosion of both time and attention. The itinerary's structured nature made these inefficiencies far more visible than they would ordinarily have been. Because every activity had been assigned a specific purpose, deviations from that purpose became immediately apparent. This realization was somewhat uncomfortable. Human beings tend to construct narratives that portray their shortcomings in a relatively favorable light. We often attribute our failures to external circumstances, while overlooking the role of our own habits. The experiment challenged this tendency by confronting me with objective evidence of how frequently my attention drifted away from tasks that genuinely mattered. The issue was not a lack of ambition or effort. Rather, it was the fragmentation of focus caused by countless minor interruptions. Perhaps even more revealing was the discovery that many of my daily decisions were governed by impulse rather than intentionality. Before undertaking this experiment, I considered myself reasonably organized. I maintained schedules, established goals, and attempted to manage my responsibilities effectively. Yet the AI-generated itinerary exposed how often my actions were dictated by immediate convenience rather than long-term priorities. I frequently selected tasks based upon what felt easiest at a given moment rather than what was most important. Under ordinary circumstances, such tendencies often escape notice because they are distributed across countless decisions throughout the day. However, within the context of a highly structured schedule, these behavioral patterns became impossible to ignore. Every deviation highlighted the difference between what I intended to accomplish and what I instinctively preferred to do. In this respect, the experiment functioned almost as a mirror, reflecting aspects of my behavior that had remained largely invisible under normal conditions. Another unexpected benefit emerged in relation to concentration. Throughout much of the day, I had been operating within clearly defined periods of focused activity. While this approach initially appeared restrictive, its advantages became increasingly apparent over time. Rather than constantly transitioning between unrelated tasks, I devoted sustained attention to a single objective before proceeding to the next. The result was not merely increased productivity, but a greater sense of cognitive clarity. This effect was particularly noticeable during intellectually demanding activities. Ordinarily, prolonged concentration often felt exhausting. Yet the structured intervals recommended by the AI appeared to reduce mental fatigue rather than exacerbate it. By establishing predictable rhythms of work and recovery, the schedule enabled a degree of consistency that I rarely achieved independently. The experience challenged my assumption that productivity required continuous exertion. Instead, it suggested that strategic allocation of attention might be more valuable than sheer effort. Equally surprising was the impact upon my perception of time itself. On a typical day, hours frequently seemed to disappear without a clear explanation. Tasks expanded unpredictably. Breaks extended beyond their intended duration. Minor distractions accumulated unnoticed. In contrast, the AI-generated itinerary introduced a heightened awareness of temporal boundaries. Because activities were associated with specific time frames, I became considerably more conscious of how each minute was being utilized. This awareness did not create a sense of pressure. On the contrary, it often produced a feeling of control. Time no longer appeared to be slipping away unpredictably. Instead, it felt structured, observable, and manageable. Even when the schedule deviated from its original design, I retained a clearer understanding of how my day was unfolding. The difference was subtle yet profoundly significant. As the experiment continued, I began to appreciate another advantage that had not initially occurred to me. The AI had effectively removed the need to negotiate with myself. Under ordinary circumstances, countless internal debates consume mental energy throughout the day. Should I begin working now or later? Should I take a break? Should I prioritize one task over another? These questions may appear trivial, yet their cumulative psychological burden is considerable. By delegating such decisions to an external system, I had temporarily eliminated much of this internal negotiation. The result was a noticeable reduction in indecision and hesitation. While I would not advocate surrendering all personal agency indefinitely, I could not deny the efficiency that emerged when certain routine choices were predetermined. The experience suggested that decision fatigue exerts a far greater influence upon daily performance than many people realize. Yet perhaps the most valuable insight concerned the distinction between optimization and perfection. Earlier in the day, I had evaluated the AI primarily according to its ability to produce flawless recommendations. Whenever the itinerary encountered difficulties, I regarded those moments as evidence of failure. By this stage, however, my perspective had evolved considerably. I realized that the schedule did not need to be perfect in order to be beneficial. Its value resided not in eliminating every inefficiency, but in reducing enough of them to create meaningful improvement. This shift in perspective fundamentally altered my assessment of the experiment. Rather than asking whether AI could completely outperform human judgment, I began asking a different question: how much could human performance improve when supported by algorithmic guidance? The distinction may appear subtle, yet it transformed the entire nature of the inquiry. Artificial intelligence was no longer being evaluated as a replacement for human decision-making. Instead, it was being considered as a mechanism for augmenting it. Despite these increasingly positive conclusions, another dimension of the experiment remained impossible to ignore. While the AI had demonstrated considerable strengths, it had also produced recommendations that occasionally bordered on the absurd. Certain instructions lacked contextual awareness. Others revealed an amusing disconnect between theoretical optimization and practical reality. Throughout the day, several moments had prompted laughter rather than admiration, exposing the peculiar limitations of computational reasoning. As evening approached, I found myself reflecting not only upon the schedule's successes, but also upon its most eccentric recommendations. Ironically, these peculiar moments proved just as illuminating as the productive ones. If the earlier stages of the experiment had revealed what artificial intelligence could accomplish exceptionally well, the next stage would reveal the situations in which its logic became unexpectedly, and sometimes hilariously, misaligned with the realities of human life. As the day progressed toward its conclusion, I found myself reflecting upon a curious paradox. The same artificial intelligence that had successfully identified inefficiencies, improved my concentration, and introduced a greater degree of structure into my routine, had also generated some of the most peculiar recommendations I had encountered in recent memory. While much of the discussion surrounding artificial intelligence tends to focus on its extraordinary capabilities, my experiment revealed another, equally fascinating dimension of the technology. Its occasional inability to distinguish between theoretical optimization and practical reality. To be clear, these shortcomings were not catastrophic. The AI did not instruct me to engage in anything dangerous or irrational. Rather, its recommendations occasionally exhibited a kind of detached literalism, a tendency to pursue efficiency with such unwavering commitment that common sense appeared to be treated as an optional variable. The resulting situations were not frustrating so much as unintentionally amusing. One particularly memorable example emerged during a period designated for mental rejuvenation. According to the itinerary, I was supposed to spend several minutes engaging in mindfulness exercises in order to restore cognitive clarity before commencing the next work session. In principle, the recommendation was entirely reasonable. Numerous studies have demonstrated the benefits of mindfulness practices for stress reduction and concentration. The problem, however, was that the recommendation failed to account for the immediate circumstances in which it was to be implemented. At that particular moment, the environment around me was far from conducive to tranquil contemplation. Background noise was unavoidable, interruptions were occurring intermittently, and the overall atmosphere was considerably more chaotic than the AI seemed to anticipate. Yet according to the schedule, this was apparently the optimal moment for reflective stillness. Sitting there, attempting to achieve a state of serenity while surrounded by distractions, I could not help but laugh at the absurdity of the situation. The recommendation itself was not flawed, it was simply detached from context. This incident illuminated a broader limitation inherent in many algorithmic systems. Artificial intelligence excels at identifying generalized principles that are statistically associated with desirable outcomes. What it often struggles to evaluate is whether the immediate circumstances are compatible with those principles. Human beings instinctively make such adjustments. If conditions are unsuitable for meditation, we postpone it. If a particular strategy proves impractical, we modify it. Algorithms, by contrast, frequently assume that optimal conditions either exist or can be approximated. Another amusing episode involved meal planning. The AI had allocated a specific period for lunch and had suggested that the meal should emphasize nutritional balance, sustained energy release, and overall dietary quality. From a health perspective, the recommendation was entirely defensible. However, after several hours of intense concentration and strict adherence to the itinerary, what I genuinely desired was something considerably less sophisticated. My inclination was toward convenience and immediate gratification rather than nutritional optimization. The contrast between the recommendation and my actual preference highlighted an important distinction between human behavior and computational reasoning. Human beings do not make decisions solely on the basis of objective utility. Emotional states, personal preferences, cravings, and situational factors frequently exert substantial influence. Artificial intelligence, however, tends to prioritize what should be done according to predefined criteria rather than what individuals are realistically inclined to do under particular circumstances. Throughout the experiment, similar examples continued to emerge. The AI repeatedly demonstrated an impressive capacity for identifying theoretically optimal behaviors while simultaneously underestimating the complexity of human motivation. It assumed that discipline would consistently prevail over temptation, that rationality would invariably supersede emotion, and that individuals would naturally prioritize long-term benefits over short-term satisfaction. While these assumptions may appear reasonable in abstract models, reality often unfolds quite differently. What made these moments especially interesting was that they revealed the fundamentally different ways in which humans and machines interpret the world. Human cognition is deeply contextual. We constantly incorporate subtle environmental cues, emotional considerations, and experiential knowledge into our decisions. Artificial intelligence, by contrast, relies primarily upon patterns extracted from data. Consequently, situations that appear straightforward from a computational perspective may appear considerably more nuanced to a human observer. As the day continued, I became increasingly fascinated by this divergence. In some respects, the AI's limitations resembled the perspective of an exceptionally intelligent advisor who possessed vast theoretical knowledge, but minimal practical experience. Such an advisor might formulate impeccable strategies under ideal conditions while remaining oblivious to the countless inconveniences, irregularities, and idiosyncrasies that characterize everyday life. The recommendations themselves would not necessarily be incorrect, yet their implementation might prove unexpectedly challenging. This realization led me to reconsider a common misconception regarding artificial intelligence. Public discourse frequently frames AI as either an imminent replacement for human judgment or an overhyped technology incapable of meaningful contribution. My experience suggested that both perspectives were overly simplistic. Artificial intelligence was neither infallible nor ineffectual. Rather, it occupied a more nuanced position somewhere between those extremes. It excelled in domains characterized by structure, consistency, and measurable objectives. It became less reliable when confronted with ambiguity, unpredictability, and context-dependent decision-making. Ironically, many of the day's most entertaining moments emerged precisely because of this mismatch. The AI was not attempting to be humorous. Its recommendations were generated through logical processes designed to maximize efficiency and well-being. Yet the absence of contextual intuition occasionally transformed otherwise sensible suggestions into scenarios that bordered on the absurd. These moments served as a reminder that intelligence and wisdom are not synonymous concepts. One may possess extraordinary analytical capabilities while still lacking the practical judgment required to navigate complex social and environmental realities. Despite these shortcomings, I found myself becoming increasingly appreciative of the experiment as a whole. The absurd recommendations did not diminish the value of the AI's contributions. If anything, they provided a more balanced understanding of what the technology could and could not accomplish. The day's successes illustrated its strengths. The humorous miscalculations illuminated its limitations. Together, they offered a far more comprehensive portrait than either perspective could provide independently. As evening approached and the experiment neared its conclusion, I realized that the most significant lessons had little to do with productivity itself. The experience had evolved into an exploration of the relationship between algorithmic reasoning and human judgment. Rather than proving the superiority of one over the other, the day repeatedly demonstrated the necessity of both. Artificial intelligence supplied structure, efficiency, and analytical rigor. Human cognition contributed adaptability, contextual awareness, and nuanced interpretation. The question, therefore, was no longer whether AI could successfully manage a single day of my life. The more compelling question concerned what broader conclusions could be drawn from the experience. What did this experiment reveal about the role artificial intelligence should occupy in modern society? To what extent should individuals rely upon algorithmic guidance? And where should the boundaries between technological assistance and human autonomy ultimately be established? These reflections would occupy my thoughts long after the schedule itself had come to an end, leading naturally into a more comprehensive evaluation of machine-guided living and its implications for the future. As the experiment drew to a close, I found myself less interested in the individual events of the day and more preoccupied with their broader significance. The schedule, the interruptions, the unexpected benefits, and even the occasional absurdities were no longer isolated experiences. Collectively, they formed a case study through which a more substantial question could be examined: what role should artificial intelligence occupy in the management of human life? Prior to undertaking this experiment, I had unconsciously subscribed to a relatively simplistic framework. I assumed that the outcome would validate one of two opposing conclusions. Either artificial intelligence would demonstrate a superior capacity for organization and decision-making, thereby exposing the inefficiencies of human judgment, or it would prove incapable of navigating the complexities of everyday life, reaffirming the indispensability of human intuition. Yet the reality that emerged was considerably more intricate than either of these possibilities. The most immediate lesson was that efficiency and fulfillment are not synonymous concepts. Throughout the day, the AI had undoubtedly improved various aspects of my productivity. Tasks were completed more systematically. Distractions were minimized. Time was allocated with greater intentionality. From an operational perspective, the experiment could reasonably be regarded as a success. However, human existence cannot be evaluated exclusively through metrics of efficiency. A life optimized according to purely quantitative criteria may appear impressive on paper, yet still fail to satisfy the deeper dimensions of human experience. People derive meaning not only from accomplishment, but also from spontaneity, curiosity, emotional connection, and the freedom to deviate from predetermined plans. Many of the most memorable moments in life arise not from optimization, but from unpredictability. Friendships, creative insights, unexpected opportunities, and personal discoveries often emerge precisely because individuals depart from structured routines rather than adhere to them. This realization highlighted a limitation inherent in many discussions concerning technological progress. Contemporary society frequently treats efficiency as an unequivocal good. Productivity applications promise to maximize output. Algorithms seek to eliminate friction. Automated systems attempt to optimize increasingly large portions of daily life. While these innovations undoubtedly offer substantial benefits, they can inadvertently encourage the assumption that every aspect of existence should be subjected to continuous optimization. My experience suggested otherwise. Certain domains of life benefit enormously from structure and analytical precision. Administrative responsibilities, routine decision-making, scheduling, and information management are obvious examples. In these contexts, artificial intelligence possesses capabilities that frequently exceed those of individual human beings. Yet there are other dimensions of life in which excessive optimization may prove counterproductive. Creativity, interpersonal relationships, ethical judgment, and personal identity often resist standardization. Their value derives partly from their unpredictability and complexity. Consequently, the experiment prompted me to reconsider the distinction between intelligence and wisdom. Artificial intelligence demonstrated remarkable proficiency in processing information and generating recommendations. Nevertheless, wisdom encompasses qualities that extend beyond analytical capability. It involves contextual interpretation, moral reasoning, emotional awareness, and the capacity to recognize when established rules should be modified or disregarded. Throughout the day, the AI repeatedly exhibited intelligence. Whether it exhibited wisdom is a considerably more complicated question. Another important observation concerned the nature of autonomy itself. At the outset of the experiment, surrendering control over my schedule seemed relatively inconsequential. After all, the arrangement was temporary, voluntary, and limited in scope. Yet as the day progressed, I became increasingly aware of the subtle psychological significance of decision-making. Choices that initially appeared trivial acquired greater importance when they were no longer mine to make. This awareness revealed that autonomy possesses value beyond its practical consequences. Making decisions is not merely a mechanism for achieving desirable outcomes, it is also an expression of individuality. The ability to determine how one's time is spent, what priorities deserve attention, and which opportunities should be pursued contributes fundamentally to personal identity. Even imperfect decisions possess a significance that extends beyond their immediate results because they reflect personal agency. At the same time, the experiment also demonstrated that autonomy is not an absolute virtue. Human judgment is susceptible to bias, inconsistency, procrastination, and numerous cognitive limitations. Many of the improvements I experienced during the day occurred precisely because certain decisions had been delegated to a system less vulnerable to these weaknesses. The challenge, therefore, is not to choose between autonomy and assistance, but to determine how they can coexist productively. In this regard, the relationship between humans and artificial intelligence may be most effectively understood as complementary rather than competitive. Public discourse often frames technological development as a contest in which machines gradually replace human capabilities. Such narratives may be compelling, but they overlook the possibility of collaboration. The experiment repeatedly suggested that the most effective outcomes emerged when algorithmic precision was combined with human judgment rather than substituted for it. Artificial intelligence excelled at identifying inefficiencies, structuring tasks, and maintaining consistency. Human cognition excelled at interpreting ambiguity, responding to unforeseen circumstances, and integrating emotional considerations into decision-making. Neither system was sufficient in isolation. Together, however, they possess the potential to compensate for one another's deficiencies. This insight may ultimately prove more valuable than any individual productivity technique I encountered throughout the day. Beyond the personal lessons, the experiment also prompted broader reflections concerning society's future trajectory. As artificial intelligence becomes increasingly sophisticated, individuals will encounter growing opportunities to delegate decisions to algorithmic systems. Recommendations regarding health, education, career development, financial planning, and even interpersonal relationships are likely to become more prevalent. The convenience offered by such technologies will be difficult to resist. Yet convenience alone should not determine the extent to which authority is transferred from humans to machines. Every delegation of responsibility entails a corresponding reduction in direct human involvement. While this trade-off may be advantageous in certain contexts, it also raises important questions regarding accountability, independence, and personal development. If algorithms become responsible for an ever-expanding range of decisions, individuals may gradually relinquish opportunities to cultivate their own judgment and critical thinking. For this reason, I believe the central lesson of the experiment is neither optimistic nor pessimistic. Artificial intelligence is neither a panacea capable of resolving every inefficiency nor a threat destined to undermine human agency. It is a tool of extraordinary sophistication, whose impact depends largely upon the manner in which it is employed. Like any powerful instrument, its value is determined not solely by its capabilities, but by the wisdom with which those capabilities are applied. By the end of the day, I no longer viewed the experiment as an attempt to determine whether artificial intelligence could outperform me. Instead, I regarded it as an opportunity to explore how technology might augment human potential without diminishing human individuality. The answer, I concluded, lies not in relinquishing control entirely, nor in rejecting technological assistance altogether, but in cultivating a balanced relationship between the two. As these reflections continued to occupy my thoughts, it became apparent that the most important question extended beyond the events of a single day. The experiment had revealed valuable insights about productivity, autonomy, and decision-making, yet it also pointed toward a far more consequential issue. If artificial intelligence continues to evolve and integrate itself into every aspect of modern life, how will our understanding of freedom, responsibility, and human identity change in the years ahead? It was a question that transcended the boundaries of this particular experiment and naturally led toward a final contemplation of the future of human autonomy in an increasingly algorithmic world. As I reached the conclusion of this experiment, I found myself reflecting on a question far more significant than whether artificial intelligence had successfully planned my day. The experience had begun as a simple exercise in curiosity, an opportunity to explore whether an algorithm could organize my time more efficiently than I could myself. Yet by the end of the day, it had evolved into something considerably more profound. It had become an exploration of the relationship between technological advancement and human autonomy, a subject that is likely to become increasingly relevant in the years ahead. From a practical perspective, the results were undeniably impressive. The AI-generated itinerary improved my productivity, reduced unnecessary distractions, and introduced a level of intentionality that is often absent from everyday routines. Many of the recommendations proved genuinely valuable, and several of the habits encouraged by the system are practices I intend to incorporate into my life long after the experiment has ended. The experience demonstrated that artificial intelligence possesses extraordinary potential as a tool for organization, optimization, and personal development. At the same time, the experiment also revealed limitations that should not be overlooked. Despite its analytical sophistication, the AI occasionally struggled to accommodate contextual nuances, emotional considerations, and unforeseen circumstances. It excelled at processing information, yet it could not fully replicate the adaptability, intuition, and situational awareness that characterize human judgment. The day repeatedly illustrated that efficiency, while important, is not the sole determinant of a meaningful life. Perhaps the most important lesson was the realization that technology and human agency need not exist in opposition. The future does not require a choice between complete technological dependence and absolute human independence. Instead, it may involve the cultivation of a more balanced relationship in which artificial intelligence enhances human capabilities without diminishing individual autonomy. In such a framework, algorithms serve as advisors rather than authorities, offering guidance while leaving ultimate responsibility in human hands. As artificial intelligence continues to evolve, society will undoubtedly face increasingly complex questions concerning trust, responsibility, and decision-making. The convenience of delegating choices to intelligent systems will become progressively more appealing. However, preserving the capacity for independent thought, critical evaluation, and personal judgment will remain essential. Technological sophistication should augment human potential, not replace it. Looking back, I can confidently say that allowing AI to plan my entire day was one of the most enlightening experiments I have undertaken. It exposed inefficiencies I had never recognized, challenged assumptions I had long accepted, and encouraged me to reconsider the nature of productivity itself. More importantly, it demonstrated that the future of artificial intelligence is not simply a technological issue, but a profoundly human one. Ultimately, the experiment left me with a conclusion that was neither entirely optimistic nor pessimistic. Artificial intelligence is neither a flawless solution nor an existential threat. It is a powerful instrument whose value depends upon how thoughtfully it is employed. The challenge facing future generations will not be determining whether machines are capable of making decisions, but rather deciding which decisions should remain uniquely human. And as technology continues to reshape the contours of modern life, that question may prove to be one of the most consequential of the 21st century.